All right, folks. So we're looking at the Cold War, and we're going to try and chunk it as best we can through decades. All right, the end of the '40s rolls in, and of course now we've got our height of the issues between East and West: communism versus capitalism, communism versus democracy. There are issues going all over the world as countries begin to decolonize, and who's going to be influential and who, where communism is going to spread, where capitalism is going to spread. This idea of containment to keep communism in. So there's a lot of stuff going on as we roll into the 1950s, and right away when we hit the 1950s, we roll into what's called a hot war. Okay, you're going to see during this time period when the United States and the Soviet Union are acting as superpowers, they're going to run into conflicts, but they're not going to be with each other. They're going to have what are called either hot wars or proxy wars, okay? And the Korean War is one of those. You have this idea of communism spreading out of North Korea and trying to unify the Korean Peninsula through communism, which has influence from Red China and from the Soviet Union, versus the support of the United States and other Western democratic countries, those in NATO who are looking to help nationalist South Korea, and of course unify the peninsula that way and keep their own sovereignty. And in doing this, it's not necessarily the United States as the main focus going to war, considering what that just happened 5 years previous in World War II, but it's really going to be a UN type war to help the nationalist South Koreans fight back against the communist North Koreans. All right, so the war, this is usually called the Forgotten War because it does happen in this time period right after World War II, and especially in the Western world, the economy is banking up and the Marshall Plan is working in Western Europe. So we're moving towards some peacefulness, yet there's conflict here, okay? And this will be a period of great peace through the Cold War because the two main superpowers actually never fight. But the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Afghanistan War, the one that involves the Soviet Union from 1979 to 1989, are the hot wars that really go on. Okay, so let's look at the Korean War real quick. First thing, like I mentioned, it is communist North Korea looking to unite the peninsula, okay, and trying to invade nationalist South Korea. And of course, we're supporting South Korea. And if you remember, South is always going to be democratic. North is always going to be communist. East is always communist. West is always democratic. So you have some influence here on which way we're going to turn. So a lot of support from the UN is going to happen for nationalist South Korea and stopping the movement of what will be the Kim dynasty in North Korea. All right, so United Nations is the one who's involved. Remember, the United Nations is an upgrade from the League of Nations, mainly because the United States is involved. There is a military which is going to go off to war here. In this case, it's going to be a coalition of different soldiers, and you have a security council, a group of countries whose responsibility is to keep peace and keep the security of the world when it comes to issues like this one. Okay, so the coalition force can be led by Douglas MacArthur. Now, you know about MacArthur back in World War II. He essentially was the Allied commander of the Pacific War, the Pacific Theater, and he's the one who's going to be there to sign the treaty on behalf of the United States that ends the conflict with Japan and takes their surrender. Okay, but MacArthur's going to have problems, especially when it comes to his dealings with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Both of them have aspirations to become president. Eisenhower does become the president eventually, but in this case, MacArthur is going to be fired and loses his job with the military, yet is able to pick it up with the United Nations, and he's going to have responsibility over this conflict in Korea. All right. So with this, the coalition is able to push North Korea along what is called the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel is a geographic line that does split what is today North Korea and South Korea. And it's mainly American forces. And as American forces are pushing the North Koreans back to the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang, they're seeing a lot of success, and they actually believe this war would be over relatively quickly, except for the fact that the Chinese were involved. Okay, and we've mentioned a million times before, the Asian fighter, the warrior, the soldier in the Asian countries are rather relentless, and the communist Chinese were no different, and they're fighting for the cause that they believe in, which is communism, the spread of communism. So as the Americans get farther north into North Korea, they're going to run into these issues fighting against Chinese soldiers, communist Chinese soldiers. They're going to push them back across the 38th parallel and begin to establish where that line is, that demilitarized zone, which we're going to have today, is. Okay, so, and that's really what's going to happen. What they come to decide after about 2.5 years of fighting is that nobody's winning this war, so they agree to an armistice. Both North Korea and South Korea agree to stop fighting, but there's no treaty. Okay, unlike World War I, where a Treaty of Versailles is signed, even though it fails, there is no treaty signed. There's still no treaty signed today, so technically, the Korean War is still going on. Every day at Panmunjom, which is this picture here, the agreement is signed to not fight. Okay, of course, if you pay attention to the news, you know the differences and what's going on and the acts of military threats on both sides. But every day at Panmunjom, they agree not to fight. And you can see the 38th parallel runs here. You know, Seoul is roughly about 50, 60 miles from the 38th parallel. Pyongyang's a little bit farther, but needless to say, they're relatively close to the midpoint line that separates the peninsula. All right, but this is a demilitarized zone. It's the most dangerous place in the world when it comes to military conflict that there is today. So with that, this hot war becomes the stepping off point for more of the Cold War issues as we move forward and where the influence of communism versus capitalism is going to happen in democracy. Okay? So in saying that, when we look at the U.S. policies and the policies of Western Europe, they continue this containment idea that we discussed in with the 1940s. And Eisenhower is going to have his containment theory, and his containment theory is called the domino theory. And like dominoes do, if one falls, they're all going to fall. So the fear is that if one country in Asia falls to communism, all will fall. So now by 1953, you have China has fallen to communism and North Korea has fallen to communism. Why the importance of saving South Korea? Of course, the big one's coming that's going to have a major effect again on the Western world, specifically the United States, is the issue of Vietnam, and that's going to happen here in 1954. Remember, there's decolonization going on around the world, and one of the areas that was colonized and is becoming decolonized is French Indochina, the areas of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in Vietnam itself, you know, really, just so you understand, communism does spread into all three of these countries, okay? It does spread to Cambodia, it does spread into Laos, but the one that was most important to the French, why it's going to be most important to the United States, is Vietnam and stopping it because of their leader. Their leader is Ho Chi Minh, okay? And we'll get to that here in a little bit. You also have a heighten of the space race, of the arms race, or the creation of the H-bomb. The Soviets are able, as we talked about in the 40s, are able to make a new nuclear weapon, an atomic bomb, and we take it a step further and making a hydrogen bomb, which has even more power to create damage. Of course, the Soviets are going to respond and do the same thing. All right, in 1954, the French are forced out of Vietnam. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was a major base for the French there in French Indochina, the communists are able to rid the French of being there. So, and that's what I'm saying about why Vietnam becomes so critical. It's because of their leader, Ho Chi Minh. He's very well liked. He's very huge into what this communist ideal is, and he's getting support from the Soviets and from the Chinese. So Ho Chi Minh is going to lead this communist takeover, which is going to force the Americans to send advisors in 1954, even after the French have left, to look after nationalist South Vietnam. And of course, that conflict is going to kind of boil over until we hit it in 1964, when communism and the Vietnam War really starts and communism really is beginning to spread. And of course, by the end of the war in 1975, the communists have taken it over. So, you know, this is the decolonization down in Southeastern Asia. It's going to make, again, this Cold War issue ramp up even more. So what they agree in 1954, the Geneva Accords in Geneva, Switzerland, is to separate Communist North and Nationalist South along the 17th parallel, hoping to accomplish the same goals that the 38th parallel had established. It's not going to happen because of the issues that we see later into the 1960s. All right, you have escalation of space race even more. In 1957, the Soviets begin to win the race in outer space by sending a satellite up there, the Sputnik satellite. This is going to force the United States to make some major changes, not just in its space program, but also at the lower levels in public education. You know, here's the point where math and science become so critical, because the idea is through the Cold War, we need to pump out scientists and mathematicians to beat the communists at their own game, which is getting up into space. And we will eventually do that by 1969 when we land on the moon. I mean, that is the epitome of beating the Russians at the space race. But really, this is where this idea comes into place, and you have nervousness going on and a lot of worry that's happening because the Soviets get up there first. Now, we will catch up, but, this really ramps up the Cold War even more. Okay, and then lastly, and this is kind of going to lead us into the 1960s. In 1959, again, there's decolonization going on in Africa and Southeast Asia, and in Latin America, the Americans still had a lot of influence, especially in a place like Cuba. Cuba, in its relationship to the United States, is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and it's very important that we kept it in kind of American influence there. And we had a American dictator, American kind of placed in Cuba, American, and in Bautista, Fausto Bautista, but he's going to kind of give in to the Americans so much that when Castro begins to start this kind of guerrilla warfare and this communist takeover, the Cuban Revolution is looking to get rid of any American sympathizers and get it back into really the poor Cubans' hands, and Castro's able to do this, and he's very intelligent, great speaker, and he's going to fight guerrilla warfare, and it's going to rid Cuba of any kind of democratic influence. Obviously, we're seeing today, now here we are roughly 50, 70 years after this happened, and we're finally getting relations back with Cuba once again, however, still very testy, and it goes back to what Castro and how Castro had led and the issues there, and that's going to be a big problem into the 1960s as well.